Today I'm going to show you how to paint a really good splash. There's a gap between these cliffs and the water just comes whoosh all the way through, and it's really great fun to watch from a safe distance. I'm using latex to cover the white areas. The latex is now dry, so I can continue with the picture. I've gently put some of a horizon in. I'm just going to put the rest in. Need to make sure that it's level. The first thing I'm going to do here is put in a mid-blue sky, because I want the emphasis to be on the dark rocks and the foam that's spraying off them. So a mid-blue sky just acts as a foil for the picture. No clouds on this occasion because it would distract from the white foam. So I've got to let that dry now. So the next thing I can do is do some of the very dark rocks before I put the sea in. And the sea is a different colour in the foreground than it is midway. It goes more grey there. Now the rocks, I'm going to mix a very dark brown with burnt umber and indigo and just put it on. I'll start with this pyramid one here that's light in some places. So I'm just going to go with the size 4 brush to start with, and it's got a ledge or something halfway across, and then quite a dark area. And it's important to get that in because the waves are bouncing around it. Then there are some patches that are a different colour. So I'll start with just the dark ones, and I'm going to make it even darker on the right hand side. So going back with more indigo and more burnt sienna, burnt umber, to make it very dark, rich colour. And then very carefully put them on, working my way down all the nooks and crannies. Then the sea is breaking over the right hand side, which I've put some latex on. Just going back again around the nooks and crannies. Well, it's got to be dark for the white water to show. So I'll join these two together now. I've got a line, and drop some wet paint in so that it'll merge. And that will also help with shaping nooks and crannies. Find its own line. And it's very, very dark around the bottom because it probably doesn't get much chance to dry at all. So coming up, I've now got slightly lighter, so I'm going to change the proportion of the brown to the blue and just put it on. Now I'm going to add some yellow ochre to highlight it, and then go back with the first brown, just take it up to the yellow ochre. That's given the rock a more three-dimensional appearance. Now coming forward now, again with the very dark mix, the indigo and the burnt sienna and the burnt umber, and it's got a line at the top, so I'm just going to follow the line across, and one lonely little bit sticking up. I'm working it down because the water is actually falling back, it's being bounced back down, so I need up and down strokes. And then at the very top there's an even darker line, so I'll go all the way across. It looks a bit spongy there because that's where my latex is, and it continues to here. So now I need to make even darker paint, a little bit more indigo, and just drop it in a straight line across the top, and then bring some of the lines down a little bit further, just merging it all in, wet into wet. And that gives the look of the waves licking it. And then over here there's another rock that's equally dark because there's not much of it showing. You almost have to do this sometimes between waves. This one's actually darker at the bottom. The waves have just licked the top. So what I'm going to do at the top is just add a little bit of yellow ochre just to push the paint back again. And moving across is even darker. So make up more dark it's a variety of the different browns will give more focus on the white foam. And then there's another rock in between and little waves on the side. So I'm just going to put a hint of one here and its friend. This rock is more than one colour, so I'm going to drop some yellow ochre in a moment to show where it is a slightly different colour, and they're almost meeting. So just drop some yellow ochre in. And I've got a variety of shapes going on there. So now I'm moving over to here. This was the example I did without the latex. So I've got coming down to a point. For those who haven't got latex, I've done one rock without it just to show you it's possible. I'm just going to make up some more dark. You just get very, very weak paint, as weak as you can make it, and draw the shape and leave the areas that will be white. And then you've got a guide to follow and you won't accidentally miss. It's not straight edge because there's water licking it. So that's coming back. It's almost as though it's two rocks. And then there's another one that's just almost touching it across here. Just varying the colour slightly. And it curves round. Now I have to make some bits a bit dark and some light, so I'm mixing up more paint again. You have to keep constantly mixing. And it seems very, very dark on the right hand side. Which makes this one look a bit pale now, so I'll just stick a bit more on there. Coming round, it's got quite a lot of light on top, so I'll just add some yellow ochre. Clean the brush off and go back to the very dark. And I'm going to add a little bit more burnt umber just to ring the changes here. And then a very dark bit in the foreground, again this little point. Now moving on to the much bigger rock that is quite vertical compared to some of the others. Go around where I can see there's a lot of dark, and the dark goes through the middle and down to just about where these two meet. It's always good to have something to map it off against. And then it's mid-brown all the way through, so I'm going to add some Indian red, or you might have Venetian red in your box, and just drop some of that in. And then there's lots and lots of yellow ochre going down to the bottom, yellow ochre. It's all a bit of a stark contrast there, so what I'm going to do is just use some mid-brown, mix it all together, just try and join it together. I'm just hitting some latex here that I put in earlier. I'm mixing up some more dark, just following it round, trying to give lost edges to the different colours. They've been eroded by the water over time, so there's no straight edges. It's just a question of where the water's bashed it hardest, or perhaps a softer piece of rock. Just going round, say everything is just lost and found edges. And then there's a dark back to it, and then more yellow ochre. There's a big patch of yellow ochre on top. And on the edge here. So I'll put those in, and then more Indian red, and the rest of it seems to be dark. So I'll just merge the colours together. It doesn't matter if there's a tiny bit of paper showing, because that could look like more spray. Just keep working around all the nooks and crannies. Right, say I'm drifting on to where I put the latex, and it's darker towards the edge here. Right. More burnt sienna, burnt umber. There's an interesting selection of rocks there. It takes your eye around, and then further down they are wetter, less obvious, so they're darker. So I'm just going to, they almost join here, just pop them in. And that gives me a lot of freedom then to work on the waves around them. Let's make it a little bit darker because it's nearer, so you'd see the colour more. And this one as well. I'm going to add a little bit more indigo to these two because they're nearer and darker. Now I'm just going to put some lost edges in, so I'm cleaning the brush and drying it off, and I'm just going to move the paint that I've already put down. Looks a little bit blue because it's probably still got some water on it. Doesn't dry off for many seconds before the next wave comes along. So it's all looking very three-dimensional now. So I'm going to stop for a moment and put the sea in. The reason I didn't put the sea in was I want to get the tones right and have the rocks showing. So I'm going to do the sea as a bluey grey. So I'm going to use a little bit of Payne's grey and French ultramarine mixed together, and then a tiny bit of Viridian, a little bit more grey. Just mix it until you're happy with it. That seems fine. And I'm just going to move the picture to get a better angle to go up to the horizon. So I'll go short of the horizon, then I'll go back in. Everybody's got their own technique for doing the horizon. But the main thing is that you do it where you're comfortable. And it's not completely flat because it is a wild sea. If it was completely flat, we wouldn't get these lovely waves. And it gets slightly softer in colour as it gets nearer, so I'm taking the grey out for the next lot of paint and just using the blue and green mixed together. I've got more flexibility of mixing the blue and green than I have of mixing the brown, so that's another reason to put the rocks in first. So I could make sure that they were dominant. Coming forward. I've got some latex here in some places, but not everywhere. Because it's white water, it doesn't matter if it doesn't actually touch the rock completely. If you put too much latex on, you can always go back and add a dab of colour. So don't rush to clean your palette off. Leave it as it is. Just a few more here just to show that it's a rough sea. Not using any more water, just using more paint. That shows up the colour of the rocks beautifully. Now that I've given the sea a moment to dry, I can put the rocks in around the splash. And there's a physical gap here between the cliffs. It's the triangle sort of separated, because it's got to be dark to give the emphasis to the splash. So just going around the edge. I might change to a smaller brush in a minute to get right to the edge, but I'm starting with the number 4. Yeah, I'm going to need a smaller one to get right down to the bottom. There's some quite interesting jaggy bits, but they all add interest to the picture, so it's worth putting them in properly. I can do some up here as well, and then I can go back to the bigger brush. Well, these are quite dark, so I'm probably going to drop a little bit more paint in, let it find its way to the edge. And then it's much lighter on top. So I'll go round the light bit, dropping more paint in as I said I would. Going down with some brown in the middle, which makes it look more rounded. And I've got latex in some areas but not others, because I was more interested in the splash than some of the outer rocks. So I'm being careful where I'm going. And then right behind the splash it seems to be grey. Now I'm just going to do a few sideways strokes to make it look more cliff-like. And on the top I'm going to go back to the smaller brush again, because it's a light area but there's a dark line behind it. That looks a good rock stack now. So while I've got the small brush clean, I'll add some yellow ochre just to show the top. There is some brown through it, but I'll just put that on for now. And then get the brush and just pop some points in. It's a bit like lost and found areas. And then coming down here, very, very dark where the splash is, probably because it's in shadow and it's extremely wet. So I've got the latex on there so I can go up to the lines. Take it round the corner a little bit. Clean the brush off, go back to a more mid-brown. Just lose the edges a little. I'm going to drop some more yellow ochre in the top, because in my reference I've got 3 larger areas of light and a little tiny bit to the side. Now going down, I've got yellow line and then grey. So I'm going to quickly make some homemade grey, which is blue, yellow ochre and French ultramarine and crimson. Just keep stirring it till you've got the colour about right. I picked homemade grey because it merges in with any of the local colours because of its 3 ingredients. I have popped a little bit of sea in the gap there. Now I want to lose some of these edges, so I'm going to use the brown again and just go through some of the yellow that I put there. Now going back to the smaller brush, on the other side here, just a little bit, a few lines going up to the white, because the darkest darks and the lightest lights touching each other have got more visual impact. So I'm just going to clean the brush off and just take them back a little bit. And then I've got some lichen or different things happening on top there. So back to the bigger brush, and it's very, very dark where it meets what I've got the latex here. Well, latex is very good, but if you haven't got it, as I showed you earlier, you can manage. Sometimes it's better to have a little bit of both. If you've got a very tight area, put some latex. And then it's very, very dark underneath again. I'm just warming it up a little, more brown. Under here it's quite brown. It sets off the rock in front. Just go round as a sort of a rock shape, like I did that one sideways and up and down. This one's just more bulbous. So I put rounded strokes on, and then a little bit darker it's in shadow here and very wet. And it almost seems concave there. Perhaps that's where the power of the water has knocked out some of the rock. And then it goes to much lighter. So I'm going to drop in some yellow ochre and then paint up to it. And there's another rock going that way. So now go back in with not quite such a dark brown. And the cliffs are still quite concave from the angle I'm looking at it. And then the first rock is very dark again. Put that in with the way it's going. They're all different shapes as though they've been eroded by winter storms. And that again is light on top. I'll just drop some yellow ochre in and find its own way. And then the cliffs are all different shapes here. So bits have been chipped off by the water. So I'm just taking the brush for a walk on the page. And then it's very dark up towards the top again. I'm just warming it up a little bit more with some Indian red. And there's a few nooks and crannies here because there's darker areas. I just do the brush all different directions in this case. And it's got a much lighter top. So cleaning the brush off and going back to the yellow ochre. It's not quite so bright as in other places, so I'm going to tint it in a minute, but I'll just put it in first. So I take a tiny bit of the existing paint and just put it on top of the wet yellow ochre. And there's some grey as well showing. So I can drop that in and it just mutes it slightly. And it goes back to being very dark again. It's obviously this bit is getting more water. But a tiny bit of yellow ochre on it. Put that on and just drop a few bits here. And it's very, very dark in the middle, so I'm just going to load the brush again. Just make a dark line. Now we're nearly ready for the splash. There's one more dark rock in the way, which was even darker than that because it's very wet. And this one here could do with being a little bit darker because that's going to get splashed every second as well. Now I've got one more rock, two more rocks in the middle here. Let's make those a bit darker. Right, now ready to tackle the splash, which isn't entirely white. There's some grey, so I've got some light grey here. I'm just going to add a little bit of the sky blue and sea blue to it. And that's on top of this rock. So the latex might not be everywhere, so I'm just doing a few brush strokes in the hope that some of it will get through the latex. And then I've got a little bit down here that's slightly more Naples yellow. So in case I've got a few gaps in the latex, I'm putting that there as well. And then I've got grey on the end of this rock. It's a little bit big actually, so I'm just going to make that a tiny bit smaller now. So don't clean your palette when you're doing this because you need to go back again. And some more rocks sticking out at the bottom of the spray. I'm going to put a bigger point on that if I can, if it'll go on. And that, just in case there's any rock showing, I'm going to get the grey again and say with the latex I might not have had 100% hit, so I could just put it on, and if there's any there it'll catch it. And again, under the wave pattern here there's some. So can't do anything with that for a moment or two, but I have noticed that this rock is pointed at the bottom. So now I cleaned the brush very, very well and come forward with some turquoisey blue, which is the water being stirred up and aerated. It's changed colour. So it seems to be around here. So I'm just going to put that in. And a tiny bit on top of this rock. And then coming forward, the water is changing direction, but it's a little bit grey, so I'm just adding some grey to the turquoise. Might look grey because there's brown underneath it, that there's a submerged rock. And coming up, just little strands, and then to a more delicate point. And so there's not latex in 100% of areas, it was just put on as a guide, and then it's quite grey again over here. And coming up with the curl of the wave, it's sort of rebounding, and a little bit more turquoisey, in fact green. This will be more evident when I take the latex off, which you can't do until the paint's dry. And then it's more grey again over here. And a little bit more green, and green through the middle. Latex isn't an exact thing to put down when you're doing this. So sometimes you have to go back and just adjust it with a brush to get it exactly where you want it to be. A little bit more grey. You can see that that is now leading you into the picture. And I'm changing the colour again, turquoise and viridian this time. And then tiny bit of French ultramarine to mute it, and a little bit of grey, and go in front here. And then in the middle it's far more grey for some reason, it's just the way it's being stirred up. And there's lots of latex there, and then a little bit of turquoise here, which I'll just move around till I meet my latex. You can see when you're meeting it because it goes bubbly. And I'll stick some down here just in case. I seem to have got all that. So now it's the white splash that is a factor, and I think I'm okay. There's a tiny bit of grey water that you can see at the bottom. So I'm just going to see whether there's any misses in the latex by putting the grey across. I think I'm done. So when that's dry, I can take it all off and then rub back any pencil lines that are too dominant. I've taken the latex off, and with a number 1 brush, just gone round if it wasn't quite right and just added a few little strokes. Where I put the paint over the latex, where I couldn't see exactly where it was, it's done what I hoped, and it's just broken up an area of white a little. It's the same here. You can't always be sure where the latex starts and finishes, but I hope you've enjoyed this picture, and you'll go and look for the nearest blowhole near you and make a splash.